Good afternoon. This is Eric Yan with EA Engineering. Just want to go over some housekeeping items with you before we get started. We are asking that attendees hold their questions until the end of the presentation. Online attendees are in listen-only mode and can ask a question by typing it into the question pane on the GoToWebinar panel or by clicking on the hand icon located on the tab off to the side of the panel. Once I see that your hand is raised, I can unmute you. I'll now turn over the presentation to Jeff Lieberfinger.
Welcome everyone to the NAOC 2019 webinar series. I am Jeff Lieberfinger, today representing the NAOC Technology Committee. Today's webinar topic is the UltraTEM, now validated for AGC through DAGCAP. As many of you know, and as the webinar title implies, the UltraTEM sensor has recently been validated by DAGCAP for use on AGC projects. Steve Billings of Tusk Geophysics will provide an overview of the UltraTEM and answer your questions after the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and made available on YouTube sometime next week. NAOC and the Technology Committee want to thank Steve and Tusk for providing the update today. I will now turn it over to Steve.
Thank you, Jeff. So the UltraTEM was developed by GAP of Brisbane, Australia, in partnership with Tusk Geophysics of Vancouver, Canada. I'd just like to point out that if you think it's August 21st, I'm talking to you from tomorrow because I'm on the other side of the international date line here in Brisbane, Australia. The UltraTEM was developed to address a wide range of metal detection problems, mostly unexploded ordnance, in both terrestrial and marine environments. So what I'm showing you in this slide collage here is a bunch of different implementations of the UltraTEM. Top left, it's a system used for deep bomb detection in Southeast Asia. Middle left, a system used for deep bombs in Germany. Bottom left is a towed array system that we use regularly in Australia. Middle bottom is a big ROV mounted system used in the North Sea. Bottom right, hand carried system we've deployed in Papua New Guinea. Above that, a cart-based system we've used in Australia. And in top right, a very big sled mounted system that we've used in the United Kingdom. But specifically today, I really want to focus on this version of the UltraTEM, which we took to Aberdeen in early August and put it through a hardware validation process. We've passed that hardware validation and then pending a couple of minor details around acceptance of SOPs and HDF5 file formats, this system will be officially validated and put on the DENX website. So an overview of the webinar. First, I'd like to spend a bit of time giving you some history on the system and describing the team that developed it. I'd then like to describe our motivation for validating this system for the North American market, and that's specifically focused around the financial risk involved with the current two-pass classification approach. I'd then like to describe our pathway to validation, then switch over, give you a brief overview of our software, and then one of the things we want to make clear is that we are offering these systems for lease. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then hopefully there'll be some time for questions at the end. So going to the first section, the UltraTEM history. We started developing the UltraTEM in 2013, and that used a combination of off-the-shelf hardware. It was actually a PXI DAC system I got from Dave George, who also made the MPV and the metal mapper. That in conjunction with some custom transmitter hardware from GAP Geophysics. Since that time, We've developed our own receiver system. That's the UltraTEM 2. We fielded that in 2015. In 2017, we brought out the UltraTEM 3. And then now in 2019, we're on to what we call the UltraTEM 4. And on the bottom of that history, I'm also highlighting a couple of other historical developments. One is a borehole-based version of the system we use regularly in Germany. The marine system, I showed you a slide, that was in the slide collage in 2016, and then the ROV-based version in 2018. Let me just talk a little bit about the team. I mean, a lot of you on the call are going to be quite familiar with Black Tusk Geophysics. As a company, we have a long history of successful CERTIP and ESTCP projects, DAGCAP accredited, develop the UXO lab software package, and have a real focus on UXO classification. You may be less familiar with the GAP group, and I wanted to put this slide up here because I think it sets the context of how we developed our equipment and why we've really focused on making very field ready, very rugged instrumentation. GAP Geophysics have been around since the 80s, and their business has been going out into harsh mining environments and remote exploration sites and doing work with EM and magnetometer systems. You don't survive very long as a service company if you're in a remote site, if your equipment's not reliable. So that's been a real key focus of us, is developing very reliable field-ready instrumentation. So this slide, it's maybe a little bit busy, but it sort of outlines the team in a little bit more detail. So we have Black Tusk. In the Queen's English, we'd call them the boffins in this collaboration. So they're the scientists who understand all of the science involved in metal detection, and they're providing recommendations to the engineers about what configuration of instrument is best suited for a particular problem. Now, within the GAP group, there's an engineering team, that's GAP Geopac, and then we have the two service businesses, GAP Geophysics, who I mentioned, their focus is minerals exploration, and then GAP EOD, whose focus is metal detection. Now, because the instrumentation is developed in-house and it's put in the hands of people that are going out into the field and using it, there's a lot of feedback that goes on in this team. So, for instance, the field guys never like LEMO connectors. That was something we discovered early on. They clog up with dust, they're hard to repair. So we basically designed the LEMO connector out of the system. So the point just being that there's a lot of feedback that goes in there when you're combining your engineers, your services, and your boffins all together in a multidisciplinary team. Now, I'd just like to walk through a couple of key UltraTEM developments. So we got started in 2013 when we had a client who had a problem with finding large, deeply buried bombs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos. The geology there is very difficult, very much like what you'd encounter in Hawaii, viscous remnant magnetized soils, and conventional technologies weren't able to detect the targets of interest, which were these 250, mostly these 250 and 500 pound bombs. They could be found down to depths of something like 10 meters. As a mining operation, LXML Sapon were very interested in seeing whether they could detect these bombs down to at least 3 meters, and then they could go in with their open cut mine, lift 2.5 meters, and then rescan that area and then keep going down in 2.5 meter increments. In 2013, we went over there to trial the UltraTEM system operating on what we call fixed loop mode. So you lay out a very big wire around the survey area, and hopefully you can see my cursor that's showing you the wire. And then that's energized by a high-powered transmitter. Now, so the Ultra 13, this the UltraTEM 1 in 2013 comprised the rugged transmitter hardware from DAGCAP and the not so rugged receiver system. It's basically a PXI DAC sitting in there. It's really a lab instrument. And you can see we've cleverly hidden it inside this little backpack so people don't notice how fragile that system is. But it was years. The next UltraTEM development I want to touch on is what we call the UltraTEM 2 Marine, and this was developed to address a large marine UXO detection problem in Portsmouth Harbour in 2016. They needed to widen the approach to Portsmouth Harbour so a large new aircraft carrier could get into the harbour. And basically we worked with a dredging company, Boskalis, who basically had to turn this bathymetry here, which you can see goes from anyway. And anyone who was at the NAOC meeting 2 years ago might recall we gave a bit of a presentation on this system. So here it is here. It's a very big system. It's over 6 meters wide, so over close to 20 feet. It comprises 5 transmitters. They're the red things in this picture. And then there's 28 receiver cubes, these cylinders. And then we have our 3 electronics boxes, one with 14 receivers, another one with 14 receivers, and then a transmitter box. We surveyed the outer part of the harbour, but also surveyed the inner part. And this is an aerial overview of the UltraTEM data, showing you just how incredibly cluttered this harbour was. All of the brighter colours are pieces of metal. And for every one of those bits of metal, we did classification on them. And this is showing you an example of a 500 kilo German bomb. On left, I'm showing the observed and predicted data in the X, Y, and Z component data. Top right, I'm showing you the polarizability that we've recovered. That's in coloured, compared to the largest item we had in our library at that time was a 6-inch naval projectile. So this was something that the client definitely would want to dig up before they dredged. During this project, there was something like 21,000 items recovered. Boskalis dredged about 3.2 million cubic meters of material, 110 pieces of UXO, including a British ground mine, 4 bombs greater than 250 kilo, or torpedo and a Dornier bomber, which was a war grave. So now I just want to talk a little bit about our motivation for putting the UltraTEM through the DAGCAP validation process and getting it ready for operation in the United States. And the primary reason for that is we think the standard 2-pass workflow is quite slow and inefficient. So to do a UXO problem now, you run a detection survey, you pick all the targets, you then go back and visit each of those targets with often a different instrument and interrogate them, and then you make your classification decision. And at the current time, there are 2 ways you do that. One, you can go with what I call a low resolution method, where you might use an EM61 as the first stage. That's got some positives. The equipment's rugged and reliable. You can cover large areas quickly, and you can make arrays. You're better able to detect deeper items as well. The other option is you can use an AGC capable sensor, such as the Metal Mapper 2x2, the MPV. The equipment is a bit less rugged. Data collection is typically a lot slower than what you get with an EM61. And you often can't detect items as deeply as you could with an EM61. Now, if we flip it around and we think of the disadvantages of the low resolution method, you often have a target positioning problem. You often can't get the targets to within 16 inches. Talking to my colleague Dave Wright, he says that number's probably close to double that in practice. You can't use things like informed source selection to reduce the number of targets you have to queue. And you typically have poor detection performance on small items and cannot separate closely spaced targets. So now if you think of the high resolution method, you generally get very good positions. You can use informed source selection to reduce the number of targets to queue, and you're much better able to resolve small items and closely spaced items as well. So we think there's 2 ways the UltraTEM can help speed up this process. The first is simply by making a better detection survey where you combine the ruggedness of an EM61 and the field worthiness of it with the high resolution data you would get from a metal mapper or an MPV. And that system there on the top left, that shows our person carried system with a swath width of about 1.8 meters. The second, and what we think is even better approach to addressing this problem, if you've got sites that are suitable for a towed array, is to completely skip that queued interrogation step and just do the entire problem in one pass. And what I'm going to show you now is some of the benefits of doing things in a one-pass mode. So I've set up an example problem of 100 acres. We're assuming there's 300 anomalies per acre, 30,000 anomalies. With an EM61 array, we're assuming you could do 8 acres a day. We're saying we deploy an UltraTEM array and equivalent 8 acres a day if we're just using it for detection. If we use the UltraTEM in what we call one-pass mode, we're going slower. We're saying that'll be half as much productivity per day. Conversely, if you use a metal mapper 2x2 for the detection phase, we're saying that's about 1 acre per day. And then here we've got our assumptions on number of anomalies you would visit per day, 200. And we're saying if you're using an advanced sensor, you'd get a 66% rejection of clutter by running informed source selection. So if you look at the first option, that's running an EM61 with a metal mapper 2x2 following up. It's something like 162.5 days in the field. If you did the metal mapper in the first stage, it takes a long time, 100 days to do the 100 acres, but you're able to reject 2/3 of the queues, so you get out of the site a little bit quicker, 150 days. If instead of using a metal mapper 2x2, you use the UltraTEM in detection mode, that's 12.5 days of survey. You reject 2/3 of the clutter, you're out of the site in 62.5 days. And then in the bottom, I'm showing if you run the UltraTEM in one pass mode at 4 acres per day, you can be out of the site in 25 field days. Now let's see how these systems compare in terms of costs. So the graphic at left shows you the cost per acre as a function of the anomalies per acre, because as all of you contractors know, you can never guess exactly what the number of anomalies per acre are. So if you went into this site and assumed it was only going to be 200 anomalies per acre, and you were using the EM61 with follow-up with the metal mapper, and instead of around $8,000 per acre, you'd have to add about $3,000 per acre, $3,200 per acre, because you've got to go and queue an extra 100 anomalies. If you're using the metal mapper, it costs you more for 200 anomalies because you spent so much on the initial survey, but your increase in cost is a bit less because you're able to use informed source selection to reduce the number of anomalies you have to queue, but you're still going up by 15% roughly. Similar with the UltraTEM, you can reduce your fixed costs for doing the detection survey, but if you're still having to go back and queue, you're still incurring that cost and that risk with additional targets. Whereas if you go in one pass mode, we claim, or we're assuming, that you don't increase your costs significantly. We've put a little cost in there for each time you have to make a dig no dig decision. There's a small cost, but you don't have to go back out into the field. So those costs are much lower than if you're doing a 2-pass approach. So now let's talk a little bit about the pathway of what we call the UltraTEM 4 system to AGC. We did a bunch of extensive tests before we headed out to Aberdeen at 2 test sites. One was a local test site in Australia at a place called Strathalbyn in South Australia. And the other was at Blossom Point in Maryland. We basically showed up for our Aberdeen validation a week early, and just spent a few days exercising the system. Then once we got to Aberdeen, we basically did 2 tests. The first test was to prove we could use the system in the 1-pass mode. So our pass criteria was get all the targets of interest within 25 centimeters and reject at least 50% of the clutter. There was also a second mode, which was purely, could we use the UltraTEM as the first step in a 2-pass queued interrogation survey? And for that, we just needed to get all the TOI within 40 centimeters or 16 inches. And then there was a limit on the number of targets we could declare, because our DAGCAP didn't want us to just be able to put a sea of flags out into the field and get all the TOI just by random chance. So let me just talk a little bit more about our 1-pass towed array. We call it the UltraTEM NATA system. NATA stands for North American Towed Array. So it comprises 11 receiver cubes. So the UltraTEM receiver cubes are a little bit bigger than what you would see in a MPV or a metal mapper. They're 15 centimeters. This system has 2.4 meters between the outer sensors. It has 5 transmitter loops, 4 of them that are horizontal, and they're about 1 meter by 1 meter, and then 1 big vertical one. If you can see my cursor, I'm tracing out where the vertical transmitter is. And because it uses gap transmitter hardware, we focus on very high currents. So the amount of current we're putting through this system is probably a factor of 5 more than what you would see going through an MPV or a metal mapper system. So somewhere in the vicinity of 30 amps of current. We have a position and orientation system on there. We really like the Trimble R10 GPS system, works very well. The Lord Microstrain IMU, same IMU that people are using in metal mappers and MPVs. We also have a flux gate magnetometer in there because the heading from the microstrain is not always accurate. And then we spent a fair bit of time and effort in developing a suspension system for the array so we can make sure we minimize the motion noise, because that's one of the challenges when you're trying to do cute interrogation while moving. Now I'm going to show you a little video here, which is effectively a walk around of the system. Here's our tow vehicle with Tough Pad, which is running BT Field software. Now, this wasn't the best tow vehicle. We much prefer diesel Kubotas. Our system in Australia has a hydrostatic clutch, so it's really good at low speed control. This is the 5 transmitter system for the UltraTEM NADA, and you can see the type of cable connectors we like. And then as you look back over the towed array, one of the big problems we've always found with any equipment is cables. So we've put a lot of effort into protecting the cables for this system. In that little white box there, that's the Trimble, sorry, the GPS is above that, and the white box has the flux gate and the microstrain. And here's the system itself. You can see again the cable connection, each of those black shapes in here, that's one of our receiver cubes. The transmitter loops are all embedded inside the system. If you look here, that's our suspension system. I'm going to show you a little bit how that operates in a minute. And then the final thing I'm going to show you is the receiver boxes. So UltraTEMs come in lots of 6. So for our 11 receiver cubes, we have 2 of our UltraTEM receiver boxes. And you just get a quick peek at what they look like. So in this next video, this is just showing you the system moving over what's admittedly a very nice, easy set of conditions. And that's kind of about the survey speed we'd be targeting. And that's sort of a lot of our work we were doing was at the 1/2 to 3/4 of a meter per second. We actually think we could go a bit faster than that. And then in this next graphic, I'm just trying to illustrate a little the way the suspension system works. So the wheels and that part of the system are completely isolated from the transmitter receiver part of the system, which is all of this device here, or structure at the back in yellow and black. Now I just want to walk through some of our test results. So we spent probably about 3 weeks at our Strathalbyn test plot in Australia doing a bunch of different tests. We'd emplaced a number of small, medium and large ISOs. These are exactly the same small, medium and large ISOs in the DoD library. We made some multi-object scenarios. You can see the soil is red. It's very hard to find soils in Australia that aren't like Hawaii with viscous remnant magnetization problems. So it was actually a bit of a challenging site because of the variable soil background. We use this site to test a number of things, including what we call the informed source selection algorithm. And so that's a bit of a fancier way to do your target picking, where you can do a bunch of screening as well. So you basically work out what's the threshold I need for, let's say it's a 37 millimeter at 12 inches. What's that threshold? Pick all those targets. A lot of those targets are going to be things that you're not really interested in. They're too small. So we do a dipole inversion of all that. We look at the dipole properties and screen out spurious, small and fast decaying sources using a range of data and model-based metrics. And then we merge them all together into what we think are legitimate target positions. They're the sources in red in this graphic. And if you just look at how accurate we can make that, scales on this plot, this is showing you the inferred position of the target versus the actual position. The red triangles are our 5 transmitter system, what we call the NATA. We also tested our 1 transmitter system there, the blue circles. The very large circle around the whole thing is a typical positional error bound for an EM61 at 28 inches. So you can see most of the targets are within better than 25 centimeters. And then if you look at the outliers, they tend to be the larger, deeper items. I mentioned we also spent a fair bit of time at Blossom Point. A good thing about going to Blossom Point is a lot of other data has been collected there, so you can compare your system to those other systems. And what I'm going to focus on in the next couple of slides is this strip here on the left, which has a bunch of 60mm mortars. So if you look first at the plot on the left, here's the UltraTEM data at the same time channel as the TEM-TADS 2x2. And we've used the same color stretch for both of these, where we've worked out the noise floor and then made this color stretch identical in terms of multiples of the noise floor. You can see the UltraTEM is able to detect the 60mm mortars all the way down to the 1 meter. And the TEM-TADS wasn't able to detect the 160mm at 75 centimeters. That was covered, and obviously they didn't extend the survey further down here, and there was no detection of the items at 1 meter. Now, if you then take that data and do an inversion, and then you're trying to classify, you can see at 0.5 meter with the UltraTEM system, you're getting a very good match. So the colored lines here are our recovered polarizabilities, and in gray is the 60mm mortar from the DoD library. I just put a note up here to emphasize the UltraTEM uses the same time gates as the MPV and Metal Mapper, so we can use the DoD Ordnance library. And actually that was one of the things we did at Blossom Point and Strath, was just work out the relative scaling of our system. These numbers here are the UX Analyze fit metric. So you can see at 50 centimeters, 25 centimeters, you easily get all the 60mm mortars. Becomes a little bit harder when you get to 75 centimeters. And it's much harder at 1 meter. And we're not sort of claiming we're good at classifying at 1 meter, but we can definitely detect things. And if you switch to looking at just the primary axis polarizability, I think you could probably classify these targets as at least targets of interest, maybe not saying that they're a 60mm mortar. Now this slide just compares the detection depth of different systems on a small ISO. So the plot at the left is showing you the UltraTEM signals of, because remember we've got 11 receiver cubes and 5 transmitters, so I'm showing you a bunch of the different profiles. The main point is we've got plenty of signal to noise at that 12-inch depth with a small ISO. And if you look at what our threshold would be for a small ISO at 12 inches, it's 32 times the noise floor for the UltraTEM. If you do a comparable calculation for the TEM-TADS, it's 9 times, and the MPV, it's 6 times. Now, if you think about clearance depths, how deep could you detect a small ISO? With the MPV, if you're assuming it's 3 times the noise to set your detection threshold, to set your clearance depth, you can detect down to about 14 inches. With the TEM-TADS, it's about 16. With the UltraTEM, it's right down to 26 inches. So the point being, because of our high-powered transmitters and large transmitter loops, we can detect items very deeply. Now, the other thing we were interested at with our Blossom Point testing was, what if you've got lots of targets in close vicinity to each other, can we extract the source parameters for those and still correctly classify them? So in this example, we've got a small ISO at 10 inches and then a 37 millimeter close to the surface, and then a T-bar fuse also close to the surface. So you can see you don't get a lot of signal from the small ISO at 10 inches compared to the other items because they're closer to the sensor, but we're able to recover the polarizabilities and identify this as a small ISO. We're able to identify the 37 millimeter as a 37 millimeter, and the T-bar fuse is not a target of interest. Now, if we increase the number of pieces of clutter, in this scenario, we've got a 60 millimeter mortar at 12 inches. We also put another 37 and a bunch of different clutter items there. And you can see with these 5 different items, we're still able to recover the polarizabilities for the 37 and the 60. And then one final example, a medium ISO at 12 inches, 37 millimeter near the surface, and even more clutter. And we were still able to recover the polarizabilities, and we would be able to classify these anomalies correctly, or these items correctly. So from Blossom Point, we then went up to Aberdeen, and as I mentioned before, there were 2 parts to our validation. The first was just detection. Could we use the system in a detection mode? So we collected the data a bit faster. 1 meter per second was more like 1.3 meters per second because it was very hard to keep our tow vehicle at the correct speed. We were using about 2 meter transect spacing. With those sort of numbers, we'd expect you'd be able to cover about 10 acres per day. The other mode that was tested was the 1-pass mode. So we've got a more stringent requirement on our positional accuracy for the TOI. We had to reject 50% of the clutter. And to do that, we went a bit slower, 0.5 meter per second, 1.75 meter transect spacing. So we made the lines a little bit tighter. With those sort of numbers, we'd expect that sort of coverage rates of around 5 acres per day. Now, the thing about Aberdeen is you just get a pass or fail. So we passed, but I can't share any other details other than we got through both of those tests. So I mentioned this at the outset, we passed the hardware validation, and for official DAGCAP acceptance of the UltraTEM, there's just a couple of little things we need to do. They want the data in HDF5 format, and we just need formal approval of our SOPs and documentation. The other thing we need to do is, because we took the 5-transmitter system to Aberdeen and got that passed, now if we want to use one of our other UltraTEM variants, we don't want to have to take that all the way back to Aberdeen. So what we can do is demonstrate to DAGCAP that if we use another system, it's going to give us good enough results to have also passed the test. And what I'm showing you here is an example of how we do that. So on right, it's the polarizabilities recovered from our 1-pass system at our test site versus the single transmitter system. So you can see the single transmitter system does very well. We're not actually intending to use that for 1-pass classification. We just want to use it for the first phase. So we think there's a compelling case that the single transmitter system would definitely meet the requirements of the first pass of a 2-pass system. But that all needs to be formally accepted by DAGCAP. And in this slide, I'm just highlighting the advantages of the UltraTEM system. High production rates, because we got wide swath width. It's deep detection, as you've seen, because of our use of high current transmitters and large transmitter loops. It's field ready. Like I said before, we've been supporting companies around the world with lease of this sort of equipment, and it needs to be rugged and it needs to be able to be working almost all the time for those clients to be happy. The positions derived from the system are very accurate. One thing I didn't mention is that we synchronize all our hardware to the 1 PPS, so there is no lag as long as the system is working correctly. That includes the IMU is also disciplined by the 1 PPS. As I showed with the examples of looking at the multiple objects close together, the system has very high resolution, and it has user-friendly software, which is going to be the next thing that I show you. So the UltraTEM uses BT Field software for the data acquisition. You can actually use BT Field for post-processing as well, and I'll make some comments on that as well. So this next video was put together by our programmer, and he overdubbed this, and I was hoping that you would be able to hear what he was saying, but you can't. So I'm going to have to try and walk you through what's going on. So we just started a survey here. We've got our past coverage history. This is from a previous survey collected. That's shown there in cyan. And then this is the interface that you see as you're driving along. You're looking at what we call the Z component data. That's a gridded image of it. Down the bottom, you're looking at a profile of the data as you're driving along. And what he's done here is he's flipped to using a filtered version of your data. So you can run basically a high-pass D-median filter in real time with BT Field. And that's why there's a bit of a delay. You're actually sitting up here where these dots are, and because you're using the filter, there's a bit of a delay before you can plot the result up. So practically in the field, we typically wouldn't use that. We would use one of the unfiltered channels so that we don't have to wait. Now, I think what happens next is they've finished the line and he's stopping data acquisition. And then we're just highlighting that you can turn off following the system, and he's going in here and he's actually going to pick a target just to show what sort of things you can do in the software. He's manually going to pick this target here, and then we're going to run an inversion in effectively real time. So here he goes, he's picked the target, and then he looks at the inversion results. So there you go, in real time we've got a inversion result available. So you wouldn't typically do this as part of a field survey, but if you're doing your IVS strip and you need to make sure that you're going to pass all your data quality objectives, that's a good thing, good capability to have. Now, in terms of software options for post-processing, what we did at Aberdeen utilized UXOLab. So that's the pathway that's going to be validated through DAGCAP. We plan to validate the BT Field software in December in conjunction with the symposium. So we've just been talking with John Jackson about the details of how we're going to do that. And then I know a lot of you on the phone are probably UX Analyze users, and that's a potential future pathway. We're more than happy to make the sensor definitions publicly available and work with Geosoft to incorporate this system into UX Analyze. But I would just encourage you to have a look at BT Field, see what it does, because a big advantage of BT Field is you collect the data with BT Field, you process the data with BT Field, you make your no-dig decisions with BT Field, and you create your target list with BT Field. So you never leave the one software package. Now, just about ready to conclude the talk and take questions. So I think I mentioned this a number of times. The UltraTEM has passed the hardware validation, but there's a couple of final steps before it's going to be listed on DENX. Now, as I mentioned right at the start, we're intending to offer the UltraTEM as a lease. Now, that's been a key business for GAP and Black Tusk for the last 4 years. And I'm showing you a bunch of different systems that we're supporting around the world. So I talked at length about the system that's in Laos. It's been operating at an active mine site since 2015. You saw the UltraTEM marine system. That was the example project in Portsmouth. There's also the ROV system for use in North and Baltic Seas. In Germany, we have a couple of systems on supported lease. In the US, Army Corps of Engineers have one of our towed array systems, and that 5-transmitter NADA system is sitting in the US right now. So we would intend to support with a local presence in either the US or through Black Tusk in Canada. So you won't be having to call someone in Australia if you got issues. But I would contest that our equipment is very rugged, very field ready. So most of the time, you're going to be running surveys and not having a lot of hardware problems. So as of today, we have 2 man-carried systems available. You'd expect coverage rates of 2.5 plus acres per day with them. And we're currently building 2 more systems, which we'll have ready by the end of the year. And then for the one pass, we've got 1 system available for immediate lease, and we're currently building a second system, which we're expecting to have ready also by the end of the year. And with that system, I'm saying, you know, we're expecting that 4 to 5 acres per day. That, of course, is going to be site dependent. It's going to be dependent on the target of interest, the site conditions. If it's very rough, you know, you're not going to be wanting to bounce the system around and collect data super fast. Whereas if it's a bit smoother, you might be able to go quite a bit faster than we've done thus far. And then I just wanted to point out there is a extensive manual on the system. We've passed that over to DAGCAP to review. And we've also developed template SOPs. So if you wanted to incorporate this system into your quality management system, we've got the template SOPs. We can make that quite easy for you. If you want to find out more about the system, I'd encourage you to contact my colleague Kevin Kingdon at Black Tusk. He's in a more appropriate time zone for all of you than I am. And now I would like to open the floor up to questions.
All right, if anyone has any questions, please enter them into the question pane. We got a couple of questions coming in. So let's go with the first question is, what are the ROM lease costs?
Yeah, so I was going to anticipate that question. I mean, at this stage, I'd encourage you to call Kevin and talk about it, because until we have a better understanding of how big the market's going to be, I don't think I'd like to commit to a lease cost now. You know, if there's only going to be a couple of systems out there, obviously prices have to be a bit higher to cover our fixed costs. But if there's a much wider uptake of systems, then obviously prices can come down.
Another question we have is, how does processing time compare to NumMapper 2x2 or UX Analyze?
Processing time. I mean, probably the most time-consuming step is running all the 1, 2, and 3 object inversions. But you know, we can do that extremely fast in UXOLab these days. We've put a lot of time and effort into speeding up those algorithms. We can also farm out some of the computational load to the cloud. And then probably where you spend more time is reviewing the data and just making sure you've met all your data quality objectives. But that's all very streamlined in UXOLab. I would say it's quite a fast and well thought out workflow.
Our next question we have, Cindy asks, what is the weight of the transmitter/receiver stretcher and also backpacks? Appears to be 2.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I have the numbers right. It might be 35 or 40 kilos all up, distributed between those 2 people. And that, yeah, I mean, I guess the thing with a lot of our equipment, actually, you can run a cart-based system with a single person. We have a version where you put the receiver effectively on the handle of the cart, and then the person pushing the cart has a backpack with the transmitter on it. So you can do it as a 1-person operation. Typically, we've always found we like to deploy two guys into the field anyway, and we're covering quite a wide swath, you know, usually 1.8 meters or more. So we're getting very good coverage rates per day.
Next attendee asks, is the upper limit of anomaly density for dynamic classification similar to QUD, i.e. 3,500 to 4,000 anomalies per acre?
I would say yes. Yeah, so we're still definitely going to get into scenarios where the anomaly density is too high for the classification process to work.
And it looks like the last question, sorry if you touched on this before and I just missed it, but question asks, when do you anticipate having rental costs available?
Well, I think if anyone contacted Kevin, we could give you rental costs on a sort of, at this stage, it would depend on the length of the project. You know, if small project, obviously higher cost per day, longer projects, lower costs. And again, until we really understand how much demand there's going to be, I'm kind of hesitant to commit to any sort of pricing.
Next attendee asks, is APG an appropriate accreditation site, given your system has a larger transmit loop and greater dB over DT?
Well, I guess what's the purpose of the hardware validation? It's to demonstrate that your system is capable of positioning all the TOI to within 25 centimeters, and that you're able to use the data to classify and make no dig decisions. So it's appropriate in the sense that, yes, we've demonstrated that. I mean, I guess there's always a question of what if you get to a much, much harder site, can you do it? But that's the same with any other system as well, right?
All right, looks like it seems to be all for questions. Thank you very much. Jeff, if you want to close it up.
Thanks, Steve, for the update, and thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. The slides and YouTube video will be made available sometime next week on NAOC's Technology Committee page. NAOC is always looking for new topics for our webinar series. So if you have a webinar idea or wish to present a webinar, please contact James Salisbury, the Operations and Standards Committee Chairperson, or myself. And again, thank you and hope everyone has a great day.